Hey everyone, and welcome back to another Tip Tuesday, where in this video we're going to be teaching you how to fix the threads on your BMX axle. So when it comes to freestyle BMX, naturally we're a little bit hard on our bikes, and one of the things that this can take a toll on are the axles of your bike. And if you have 14mm male axles or just male axles in general, grinding and just riding and the bike falling can have an effect on the threads of the axle, making it hard to get the hardware and the axle nuts on and off. And this can be a huge pain and can sometimes cause you to just not be able to work on your bike. So in this video, we're going to be covering one method that I've used to fix the threads on these axles. And in my opinion, this is the only method that anyone should ever use when fixing threads on one of these, because it's the safest and most reliable. And that is to use the proper size thread cutting tool or die. And this is a 14mm by 1mm die in the proper handle for it. I got this off of Amazon or eBay. I'm not exactly sure. Just if you're gonna pick one of these up, make sure you don't buy the cheapest one, but you don't have to go out and spend hundreds of dollars on one of these. Once you get one of these, you're ready to fix the threads on your axle. And the reason why I'm recommending this method is because using a file or anything else that you might think of to try and fix the threads on this axle has a high probability of ruining the axle. And that's not what we want, because in all reality, buying this tool and a handle for it is much cheaper than replacing one axle alone. And this tool will literally last you a lifetime, allowing you to fix any and all axles that you need to that correspond with it in size. And any other method that you might try to use or come up with might ruin your axle and make you have to buy a new axle or this tool anyways. So enough talk, let's get over to the vise and get to showing you guys how to use this tool to fix the threads on your BMX axle. So I want to clarify before we begin that these are two separate tools that you're going to have to purchase separately. On the left, we have the 14mm by 1mm thread cutting die, and then on the right, we have the handle that it goes into. I'll leave links to both of these in the description below. Just be aware that you're going to have to buy both of these and that they're around $15 to $20 each. So whenever you get these in the mail, they're going to come separately. When we take a closer look here, we can see on the top that it says M14 times 1.0. That's the 14mm times 1.0 millimeters. This is the only thread cutting die size that is going to work on a 14mm male BMX axle. And I believe, from what I remember from using this last time, that the numbers are on the top of the die so that it will thread in through the bottom. So let's try that now with our axle. And that is correct. So it threads on, and you know that it's working because it's threading on very easy and there's no force here. So we're going to take this off of the axle and we're going to place it in the handle. And if you notice and you look around on the die, there is a line on the top, and then it's got these 4 indents on the sides. These indents go where the screws go, and the line goes in the middle screw on the top of the handle. So it's very easy to do. So let's go ahead and put it in the handle here and tighten our screws down. You just want to make sure that all of the screws are loose enough so that you can get the die into the handle. It should go in very easily. If it gets caught up, just loosen the screws that get stuck. And now we can tighten all of the screws down and secure the die in the handle. We don't want this going anywhere, so we're going to use a screwdriver to tighten them down snugly, just enough so that we know that nothing's going to go anywhere while we're using it. And I'm not claiming to be a machinist here in doing this. I've just done it several times now with several different axles, a few of which had almost unrecoverable threads. So I'm familiar with the process enough to where I feel confident in showing it to you guys. So now we have the thread cutting die in the handle, and we have it ready to thread onto the axle. So we can start it, make sure everything looks good, make sure everything looks centered as it does. And now I think we are ready to begin. And to do so, we want to go over to our vise here. This vise here has some magnetic padding on it. Even so, we're going to want to get some type of a rag to wrap around our axle before we put it into the vise. And even though we're going to be clamping it in a safe area, we just want to make sure that we're not hurting anything when we clamp it down. So we've got our axle here with the side we want to start on facing up. Let's wrap the rag around it and put it into the vise and then clamp it down, making sure that we're clamping on this middle surface of the axle, because this just sits in the middle of your hub and nothing's really going on here. This is a safe area to clamp. We just want to make sure that we're definitely not going to hurt anything on the axle, and we want to be thinking about this at all times. So we get it into the vise here. We want to make sure that when we're clamping this on here that it's facing straight up and not at too much of an angle either direction. At this point, we're ready to start using the thread cutting die to fix the threads on our axle. But before we get started, we want to make sure that we have some type of lubrication on the axle and in the thread cutting die the entire time that we're doing this, because naturally metal on metal causes friction and friction causes heat. And if you get too much heat in here, bad things can happen. That's all you really want to be concerned with, is that if there's too much heat, something bad is going to happen, and that you always want to have lubrication. There is a product called thread cutting oil, which is specifically made for this purpose, but I don't have any of that on hand. What I do have is some WD-40, which, as long as we're careful and we use a lot of it and we just go slowly with this process, it should be okay. So let's spray some WD-40 on our axle here, directly onto the threads and the table behind them. Now that we've got it onto the axle, let's start threading the thread cutting die onto the axle. It should go on very easily unless your threads are extremely messed up. What you want to make sure before you go any further with this is that everything looks like it's square. It looks like the axle is going straight into it. And if you have to, you can take the axle out of the vise, flip it upside down, make sure it looks like it's going perfectly perpendicular to the thread cutting die. This one went on very easily, so I know it's grabbing the threads that are already existing. All we're needing to do here is clean them up. So let's start turning the thread cutting die, and you're going to feel resistance. So as you go, you want to just back off, and you want to make sure that you don't go too far and too fast, because you're cutting threads and you're cutting metal, and metal is going to build up within the threads of the die. So you back it off, spray on some more lubrication, and then you go down again. And you just repeat this process all the way until you're at the very bottom of the axle. So I'm going to do that, remembering that each couple turns, we need to back off a few more turns, and every little bit, we want to spray some more lubrication onto the axle and the die. And you'll notice as you do this that it gets easier and easier to thread on through the places that you've already done as you back it off. And when I do this, sometimes I take the die all the way off of the axle and wipe the threads down just to make sure that everything is staying clean, and spray on some more lubrication before putting it back on. Because remember, we want to be extra careful with this so that we make sure we don't hurt the axle in the process. And unless you have a very, very messed up axle, this should go pretty smoothly. It should thread on very easily. This isn't very warm, so we're not creating too much friction yet. And like I've said several times, I'm not a machinist, so I'm being super extra careful with this entire process. I don't want to hurt anything while I'm doing this at all. If things feel like they're getting tight while you're doing this, slow down a little bit, spray on some more lubrication, and as you feel like you're getting closer to the bottom, you definitely want to make sure that you're paying attention to where the die is at, because you don't want to go too far down, and you want to be ready so that you know exactly what you're doing at all times. As I've said at least once before in this tool is much cheaper than replacing an entire axle. The trick to these things is definitely going slow and being patient with the process. And as long as you're slow and you're patient with it, it will work out in the end. Another thing we can do to check the process of things and the progress is take the die all the way off of the axle, grab an axle nut, and thread it onto the axle. And as you can see, it's going on pretty smoothly until we get down to about where we were at with the die. Another thing to note in this process is that you are going to get dirty. One other thing you might want to consider with this is taking a wire brush to your threads just to make sure that they do need fixed and that it's not just something in your threads. Most of the time though, when it comes to the very top here, they do get beat up pretty badly and they do usually need it. So let's put the axle nut back on here. Obviously, when it comes to an axle, we're not going to have to tighten the axle nut all the way down to this point, but there is hardware that goes onto the axle and tightens all the way down to the bottom of the threads almost. So we want to make sure that that hardware is going to screw on here nice and smoothly. So let's continue the process. So as you could see there, sometimes it gets pretty tight in this process. I go back and forth and wiggle it. Sometimes it moves in the vise. I had to get rid of these pads here because they were allowing it to move too much. And I think that I might have this towel here wrapped a few too many times as it's allowing the axle to turn in it. So we may have to lessen that as well. But it feels like we're getting close to the end of our threads here, and it looks like it as well. Let's use more lubrication. That is the most important part in doing this, aside from being careful. You usually can tell you're at the bottom because the extra little bearing race stops the die from going any further. Another thing worth mentioning is that if you feel the die and it feels like it's getting hot, you definitely want to take a break for a second because you don't want things getting too hot while you're doing this. And now we've almost got the die off of the axle, so we can grab a nut and check how far down it goes and how smoothly it does so. Okay, try it out here. After we wipe it down, just make sure that there's nothing in our threads. And as you can see, it tightens all the way down against our bearing race here up to where our hardware will tighten down to. So the axle nut goes on smoothly. That means our threads are fixed and clean. To show you guys where we started at and how bad the threads were on the side that we just finished cleaning up, let's tighten this axle nut down on the opposite side and see what happens. So it goes on smoothly at first, and then it just hits a stopping point. And to put it on any further, we can't do it by hand. And if we did, we might get the axle nut stuck. So that's what we were dealing with before we cleaned up the threads on this side. Now we'll go ahead and clean up the threads on the opposite side and come back and outro the video showing you guys how smoothly this axle nut tightens onto both sides compared to this impossible to tighten by hand that we have right now. Okay, so we're finishing up with the other side here. We'll wipe off the threads. You guys saw how bad it was when we started. Let's tighten this axle nut down. And look how easily it tightens all the way down to the bottom of the threads. You'd never know that there was an issue with either of the threads on this axle. So there you have it. That's just about going to wrap up this video on how you can use a thread cutting die to fix and clean up the threads on your 14mm BMX axle. As you saw, it was a fairly simple process to go through. We just had to take the right steps to make sure that we were careful and doing everything properly as to not mess up our axle and have to buy a new one in the process. It's a lot cheaper to buy one of these than it is to buy one of these. And as you can see, now that we're done cleaning up these threads, all it takes is a snap of the fingers to get the axle nut to bottom out on the axle. That's how smooth and clean these threads are now that we've run through them with the thread cutting die. So if you have an axle that you're having trouble getting your axle nuts or hardware onto, chances are this will solve your problem. And like I said earlier, you definitely don't want to do any other method that you might think will help clean your threads up other than maybe using a wire brush, just because a wire brush isn't going to hurt your axle the way that using a file or anything else that you might think of can. And you definitely don't want to spend the money to replace your axle when you could spend a little bit less money and get a thread cutting die and handle and gain the ability to fix 14mm axles or whatever size you buy for as long as the tool lasts. With that being said, I want to thank you guys for watching. I hope that you learned something and found this video useful. If so, hit the subscribe button down below. It's free and there's no reason not to. I come out with other videos like this on Tuesdays when I have a tip or a trick to talk about, with other types of riding videos throughout the week, and a BMX news video on Friday. Thank you guys again for watching, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.